The convoy never existed. At 0340 hours, in a cramped operations center at Forward Operating Base Blessing, Lieutenant Commander Jake Hartley studied the infrared feed from an MQ-9 Reaper circling 8,000 feet above the Pesh River Valley. The screen showed what intelligence analysts had warned about for 3 days, a staging area where Taliban fighters were assembling for a coordinated ambush on Route Silver, the only artery connecting coalition forces to isolated outposts in the mountains. 17 fighting-age males, probable weapons cache under the eastern structure, the SIGINT specialist murmured, her eyes locked on intercepted radio chatter. They're waiting for something big. Hartley's SEAL team element, call sign Archangel 3, had been tasked with disrupting insurgent operations in Cunner without escalating kinetic engagement. Rules of engagement were tightening. Every firefight meant investigations. Every civilian casualty meant political storms back in Washington. The mission parameters were clear. Neutralize a threat, but don't create an international incident. The Taliban cell was dug into a compound overlooking a choke point where the dirt road narrowed between cliff faces. Any convoy passing through would be shredded by PK machine gun fire and RPGs. Intelligence suggested they were waiting for a resupply column scheduled to move in 72 hours. We could call an airstrike, suggested Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves, the team's senior enlisted. Grid coordinates are solid. 1 JDM, problem solved. Hartley shook his head. Compounds too close to civilian structures. Collateral damage assessment puts it at 8 probable noncombatants within blast radius. Washington won't authorize it. The room fell silent, except for the hum of cooling fans and the crackle of distant radio traffic. Then Petty Officer First Class David Chun, the team's communications specialist, looked up from his terminal. What if we give them what they're waiting for? Hartley turned. Explain. Chun pulled up a map overlay. They're monitoring our radio nets. We know this because we've been feeding them garbage for weeks and watching them reposition based on it. What if we broadcast in the clear like we're being sloppy, details about a large convoy movement? Make them think the resupply column is coming early, tomorrow night, instead of 3 days from now. They'll activate the ambush, Reeves said slowly, understanding dawning. For a convoy that doesn't exist. Chin finished. The plan crystallized quickly. Over the next 6 hours, Archangel 3 orchestrated what the intelligence community would later call Operation Phantom Freight, a completely fabricated military movement designed to bait the Taliban into revealing themselves and wasting resources. At 1,600 hours, U.S. radio operators began transmitting encrypted traffic on frequencies they knew had been compromised. The messages were deliberately sloppy, using old ciphers the Taliban had already broken through Pakistani ISI contacts. They referenced vehicle manifests, ammunition counts, movement times. They mentioned a 30-truck convoy departing Jalalabad airfield at 2,200 hours, arriving at FOB Blessing by dawn. The insurgents took the bait. By 1,800 hours, drone footage showed the Taliban compound erupting with activity. Fighters emerged from buildings, checking weapons, positioning heavy machine guns along the ridgeline. Spotters moved into concealed positions with radios. The entire ambush apparatus activated like clockwork. Hartley watched from the operations center as the enemy committed their forces. They're pulling fighters from 3 other cells, the intelligence analyst reported. We're seeing movement from the Waigao Valley and Karengal. They think this is their big score. At 2,200 hours, the time the fake convoy was supposed to part, SEAL snipers and forward observers moved into positions on ridges overlooking the ambush site. They carried no intention of engaging, only cameras, laser designators, and biometric collection equipment. The Taliban fighters waited, and waited. At 0100 hours, confusion spread to the insurgent radio net. Where are the Americans? Voices crackled in Pashto, intercepted and translated in real time. The convoy should be here. By 0300, the enemy began to fracture. Some fighters argued for staying in position. Others worried they'd been deceived. Leaders bickered over poor intelligence. The entire ambush element, which had taken weeks to organize and position, began dissolving into argument and paranoia. At 0430, as the first gray light touched the Hindu Kush Mountains, The Taliban withdrew. But Archangel 3 wasn't finished. As the insurgents moved back toward their compound, exhausted and confused, they found the road blocked, not by American forces, by a rock slide that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. SEAL engineers had quietly collapsed a section of mountain trail using precisely placed charges that looked like natural erosion. The fighters were forced to take an alternate route, one that funneled them directly past 3 concealed observation posts where SEAL intelligence specialists photographed every face, recorded every voice, mapped every relationship. By sunrise, the U.S. had biometric data on 47 insurgents, including 2 high-value targets who'd been ghosts for months. 3 days later, when the real resupply convoy moved through Route Silver, it passed without incident. The Taliban cell, demoralized and distrusting their own intelligence networks, had withdrawn from the area entirely. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single American or Afghan civilian was harmed. But an entire insurgent network had been mapped, deceived, and neutralized through nothing more than understanding how the enemy thought, and giving them exactly what they expected to see, until reality collapsed beneath them. In the after-action report, Commander Hartley wrote, "The enemy's greatest vulnerability isn't their weapons or their training. It's their assumptions. Make them believe what they want to believe, and they'll defeat themselves." The Ghost Convoy became a case study at SEAL training facilities, a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one you never have to fire. The village of Margis at the crossroads of blood and opium. By early 2011, this cluster of mud brick compounds in central Helmand had become a Taliban stronghold, a place where insurgent commanders moved freely, where IEDs were assembled in family courtyards, where black flag flew openly. U.S. Marines had cleared the area during Operation Moshtarak a year earlier, but the Taliban had returned like floodwater, filling every space the Americans couldn't permanently hold. SEAL Team 7's task unit Greyhound had been tasked with a mission that sounded simple on paper: eliminate or capture a Taliban explosives facilitator known as Hamza the Engineer, responsible for IED networks that had killed 18 coalition soldiers in 3 months. The problem was Hamza never stayed in one place long enough to target. He moved between safe houses, always surrounded by civilians, always one step ahead of intelligence. Kinetic operations, raids, airstrikes had failed. Every attempt to capture him resulted in firefights that killed bystanders and turned the population further against coalition forces. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, commanding Greyhound's Alpha Platoon, sat in a compound-turned-patrol base, studying intelligence reports by candlelight. His team had been in Marja for 6 weeks, conducting presence patrols, meeting with elders, trying to separate Taliban from civilians in a place where the line had long since blurred. "We're not going to shoot our way to Hamza," Cross told his team during a night briefing. "Every bullet we fire here creates 2 more insurgents. We need to make him vulnerable without making ourselves the enemy." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: an elderly imam named Mullah Azazullah. Azazullah was the spiritual leader of Marja's main mosque, a man who'd survived Soviet occupation, civil war, Taliban rule, and American intervention. He was no friend of foreign soldiers, but he was also no extremist. The SEALs had protected his mosque during a firefight weeks earlier, refusing to use it as a fighting position even when tactically advantageous, a gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed. Through an interpreter named Fahim, a former Afghan army officer, Cross approached Azazullah carefully, not with demands or bribes, but with a question. "The man Hamza," Cross said during a team meeting in the mosque courtyard, "he brings death to this village, not just to Americans, to your people. How many children have died on roads he's seeded with explosives?" Azazullah's weathered face remained impassive. "And how many have died from your helicopters?" Cross didn't deflect. "Too many, which is why we're talking instead of shooting." Over 3 weeks, a fragile understanding developed. Azazullah didn't support the American occupation, but he also didn't support the Taliban's brutality. Hamza had recently executed a village elder who refused to store explosives in his home. The Taliban's opium taxation was starving families. The endless war was consuming a generation. "What do you want from me?" Azazullah finally asked. "Information," Cross said, "and a choice." The plan they developed together violated every conventional counterinsurgency playbook, but it worked because it understood the human terrain better than any satellite image could. Azazullah would publicly announce a community jirga, a traditional council meeting, to discuss terms for reducing violence in Marja. He would invite Taliban representatives, claiming he had negotiated American withdrawal from certain areas in exchange for reduced IED attacks. It was plausible enough that the Taliban would have to respond or lose face among the population. The message was simple. If you claim to fight for the Afghan people, come and prove it in front of them. Hamza took the bait, but not in the way Cross expected. The engineer didn't attend the jirga himself, too cautious for that. Instead, he sent a lieutenant, a young commander named Kadir, with instructions to assess whether the meeting was legitimate or a trap. Cross and his SEALs never entered the mosque. They stayed blocks away, invisible, monitoring radio traffic and watching through long-range optics as Kadir arrived with 4 bodyguards. What happened next had nothing to do with American firepower. Azazullah stood before the assembled villagers and Kadir's delegation and did something extraordinary. He told the truth. "These men," he said, gesturing toward the Taliban fighters, "claim to protect Islam in Afghanistan, but they bring death to our doorsteps. They store explosives in our homes. They force our sons to fight and our daughters to hide. They grow rich on opium while we starve." The villagers, who had lived in silence and fear for months, began to murmur agreement. Kadir tried to respond, to justify, to threaten, but Azazullah cut him off. "If you have courage, bring Hamza himself to face the people he claims to protect. Let him explain why our children die on roads he mines." It was a public challenge the Taliban couldn't ignore without looking weak, but couldn't accept without exposing their leadership. Kadir stormed out of the mosque, humiliated. What Cross had counted on was human psychology, shame, pride, and a desperate need for legitimacy in a tribal society where reputation was currency. Within 48 hours, Taliban radio intercepts showed internal fracturing. Hamza was furious at Kadir for walking into what he now believed was a propaganda trap. He began moving erratically, breaking operational security, lashing out at subordinates. 3 nights later, Afghan National Army commandos, tipped off by villagers who'd attended the jirga, captured Hamza at a compound in the outskirts of Marja. He surrendered without firing a shot, his protective network dissolved by doubt and public humiliation. The SEALs never entered the compound. They never fired a weapon. They never had to. In his debrief, Cross wrote, "We didn't defeat Hamza with bullets. We defeated him by making him irrelevant to the people he claimed to represent." An imam did more damage to the Taliban with words than we could have done with a dozen raids. The operation remained classified for years, not because it was violent, but because it revealed something the military-industrial complex struggled to accept, that understanding culture, religion, and human dignity could be more lethal than any weapon system. Mullah Azazullah continued leading his mosque until his death in 2014. He never accepted American money. He never became an ally in any formal sense. But he made a choice, the choice to speak truth in a place where silence had reigned. And sometimes that's the only weapon you need. The Taliban commander known as Redbeard had killed 11 coalition soldiers in 6 months. His weapon wasn't an RPG or a suicide vest. It was information. Redbeard ran an insurgent intelligence network in Kandahar province that intercepted coalition radio traffic, tracked patrol patterns, and positioned ambushes with eerie precision. His fighters seemed to know where Americans would be before the Americans knew themselves. SEAL Team 3's Task Unit Raider had been hunting Redbeard since April, but every lead evaporated like mist in the Afghan sun. He never used the same phone twice, never slept in the same compound, and communicated through couriers who'd swallow SIM cards if stopped at checkpoints. The breakthrough came not from intelligence analysts or informants, but from a cryptologic technician named Petty Officer Second Class Elena Vargas, who'd spent 3 years at NSA before joining the teams. She noticed something the pattern analysts had missed. Redbeard's network wasn't just intercepting U.S. communications. They were responding to them in real time, sometimes within minutes. That suggested they had a scanning receiver, probably a Chinese-made commercial unit modified to track coalition frequencies. They're listening to us the same way we listen to them. Vargas explained to Lieutenant Commander Brian Keller during a midnight briefing at Kandahar Airfield, which means we can feed them whatever we want. Keller, a veteran of 4 deployments who'd grown skeptical of technological solutions, raised an eyebrow. We've tried deception broadcasts before. They adapt. Because we've been obvious about it, Vargas countered. We send fake traffic. They ignore it or counter it. But what if we don't try to deceive them at all? What if we just give them too much truth? The concept was elegantly simple: cognitive overload. For 2 weeks, Task Unit Raider began broadcasting massive amounts of legitimate radio traffic, real patrol routes, actual convoy movements, genuine operational updates. But they broadcast everything all at once, across multiple frequencies simultaneously. It was information warfare by drowning. If the enemy hears 100 true things and can only act on 3, how do they choose? Redbeard's network, accustomed to cherry-picking valuable intel from sparse communications, suddenly faced a fire hose of data. Every patrol became a potential target. Every convoy looked significant. Every radio call could be the one that mattered. Taliban fighters began activating ambushes for routine resupply runs, wasting ammunition, and exposing positions for minor targets. They repositioned forces based on accurate intelligence that led nowhere tactically important. Their entire operational tempo became reactive, chaotic, exhausted. Meanwhile, Vargas worked a parallel track, identifying the unique electronic signature of Redbeard's scanning receiver. Every electronic device emits a faint electromagnetic fingerprint. Spurious emissions from oscillators, power supplies, display screens. It's nearly impossible to detect in normal conditions, but Vargas wasn't working in normal conditions. She had access to SOC's most sensitive direction-finding equipment, flown in from Fort Meade specifically for this operation. Over 3 weeks, every time coalition forces broadcast high-priority traffic, Vargas's team swept the electromagnetic spectrum looking for receivers that activated in response. They found dozens, Taliban, civilians, even Afghan National Police with compromised radios. But one signal appeared consistently, always in different locations, always moving. A Chinese Hanronda HDR, 108 commercial receiver modified with an external antenna. The modifications created a specific harmonic distortion that became Redbeard's electronic signature. We can't pinpoint his exact location, Vargas admitted, but we can track his general area and movement pattern. That was enough. On July 23rd, coalition forces broadcast detailed plans for a high-value convoy carrying communications equipment through the Arghandab district, a route that passed through Taliban-controlled territory. The broadcast was legitimate. The convoy was real, but the timing was flexible. Redbeard activated. His receiver lit up on Vargas's equipment, triangulated to a compound cluster near the village of Khosrow. Taliban radio chatter erupted. They were mobilizing for what they thought would be a significant interdiction. But instead of sending the convoy into an ambush, Keller did something unexpected. He delayed it by 18 hours and positioned his SEAL element in observation posts surrounding the ambush site. For an entire day, Redbeard's fighters waited in the summer heat, hidden in irrigation ditches and abandoned compounds, watching a road where nothing came. The psychological effect was devastating. Intercepted communications showed confusion turning to paranoia. Had their intelligence been wrong? Was this a trap? Were there informants in their network? Redbeard himself took to the radio, breaking operational security for the first time in months, demanding to know why the Americans hadn't appeared. That single transmission was enough. NSA assets locked his location to a specific compound. Afghan Crisis Response Unit commandos, advised by SEALs, surrounded the building at dawn the next morning. Redbeard attempted to flee through a tunnel system the SEALs had already identified using ground-penetrating radar during their observation phase. He emerged directly into the hands of Afghan forces, disoriented and unarmed. The capture happened without gunfire. The most dangerous insurgent intelligence operative in Kandahar province was defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior understanding of how information flows and how minds break under uncertainty. In the after-action review, Vargas noted something that would later influence electronic warfare doctrine across JSOC. We didn't need to hide our communications. We just needed to make the truth overwhelming. Deception works, but sometimes honesty, deployed strategically, is even more effective. Give the enemy so much accurate information that they can't process it and they'll paralyze themselves. The operation remained classified until 2019, when portions were declassified as teaching material for psychological operations and cyber warfare courses. Redbeard spent 6 years in detention before being released as part of a prisoner exchange. By then, the war had changed, the technologies had evolved, and the methods he'd mastered were obsolete, rendered useless by an American intelligence specialist who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you hide, but what you reveal. The valley of Kamdesh was dying by degrees. Nestled in the jagged mountains of Nuristan province, Combat Outpost Keating had been attacked so many times that soldiers stopped counting. The position was indefensible, surrounded by high ground, isolated, resupplied only by helicopter when weather permitted. It was a monument to strategic errors, kept operational long past military logic by bureaucratic inertia and political stubbornness. In October 2009, 300 Taliban fighters had nearly overrun COP Keating in one of the most intense battles of the war. 8 Americans died defending a base that would be abandoned weeks later. The attack revealed what everyone already knew. Some fights can't be won by holding ground. A year later, SEAL Team 10's reconnaissance element, called Sign Dagger 6, arrived in the region with a different mission. Not to defend, not to attack, but to understand why the valley kept bleeding. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Santos had spent 18 months studying insurgent tactics in Afghanistan's eastern provinces. He'd read every after-action report from Kamdesh, Wanted, and the other mountain outposts where Americans had fought desperately against enemies who knew every stone, every trail, every sight line. We keep treating these valleys like they're chessboards, Santos told his team during their initial reconnaissance. But the Taliban don't play chess. They play with memory. They've been fighting in these mountains for 40 years. Soviets, warlords, us. They know things we'll never learn from satellite images. Dagger's IXS mission was to map insurgent infiltration routes through the Kamdesh Valley without engaging enemy forces. Rules of engagement were strict. Observe, document, report. Do not compromise the element. Do not create incidents that would require extraction. For 3 weeks, Santos and 5 other SEALs moved through the mountains like shadows, sleeping in caves, drinking from streams, watching. What they discovered changed how Special Operations Forces understood terrain-based warfare. The Taliban weren't moving through the valleys randomly. They were following ancient routes, trails carved by centuries of trade, migration, and war. Some paths were visible only as slight depressions in scree fields. Others followed ridgelines that looked impassable, but provided concealed movement corridors. The insurgents navigated by landmarks invisible to American maps, a distinctively shaped boulder, a dead tree, a specific configuration of rockfall.